Section 17. From A Journal of the Plague Years. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. A Journal of the Plague Years by Daniel Defoe. Section 17. This running of distempered people about the streets was very dismal, and the magistrates did their utmost to prevent it. But as it was generally in the night, and always sudden when such attempts were made, the officers could not be at hand to prevent it, and even when any got out in the day, the officers appointed did not care to meddle with them, because as they were all grievously infected, to be sure, when they had come to that height, so they were more than ordinarily infectious, and it was one of the most dangerous things that could be to touch them. On the other hand, they generally ran on, not knowing what they did, till they dropped down stark dead, or till they had exhausted their spirits so as that they would fall, and then die in perhaps half an hour or an hour. And, which was most piteous to hear, they were sure to come to themselves entirely in that half hour or hour, and then to make most grievous and piercing cries and lamentations in the deep afflicting sense of the condition they were in. This was, much of it, before the order of shutting up of houses was strictly put in execution. For at first the watchmen were not so vigorous and severe as they were afterward in keeping the people in; that is to say, before they were, some of them, severely punished for their neglect, failing in their duty, and letting people who were under their care slip away, or conniving at their going abroad, whether sick or well. But after they saw the officers appointed to examine into their conduct were resolved to have them do their duty or be punished for the omission, they were more exact, and the people were strictly restrained, which was a thing they took so ill and bore so impatiently that their discontents can hardly be described. But there was an absolute necessity for it, that must be confessed, unless some other measures had been timely entered upon, and it was too late for that. Had not this particular, of the sick being restrained as above, been our case at that time, London would have been the most dreadful place that ever was in the world. There would, for aught I know, have as many people died in the streets as died in their houses, for when the distemper was at its height, it generally made them raving and delirious, and when they were so, they would never be persuaded to keep in their beds but by force, and many who were not tied threw themselves out of windows when they found out they could not get leave to go out of their doors. It was for want of people conversing one with another in this time of calamity that it was impossible any particular person could come at the knowledge of all the extraordinary cases that occurred in different families, and particularly I believe it was never known to this day how many people in their deliriums drowned themselves in the Thames, and in the river which runs from the marshes by Hackney, which we generally call Ware River or Hackney River. As to those which were set down in the weekly bill, they were indeed few, nor could it be known of any of those whether they drowned themselves by accident or not. But I believe I might reckon up more who within the compass of my knowledge or observation really drowned themselves in that year than are put down in the bill of all put together, for many of the bodies were never found, who yet were known to be lost. and the like in other methods of self-destruction. There was also one man in or about Whitecross Street burned himself to death in his bed. Some said it was done by himself, others that it was by the treachery of the nurse that attended him, but that he had the plague upon him was agreed by all. It was a merciful disposition of Providence also, and which I have many times thought of at that time, that no fires, or no considerable ones at least, happened in the city during that year, which if it had been otherwise would have been very dreadful, and either the people must have let them alone unquenched, or have come together in great crowds and throngs, unconcerned at the danger of the infection, not concerned at the houses they went into, at the goods they handled, or at the persons or the people they came among. But so it was that, excepting that in Cripplegate parish, and 2 or 3 little eruptions of fires, which were presently extinguished, there was no disaster of that kind happened in the whole year. They told us the story of a house in a place called Swan Alley, passing from Goswell Street, near the end of Old Street, into St. John Street, that a family was infected there in so terrible a manner that every one of the house died. The last person lay dead on the floor, and, as it was supposed, had lain herself all along to die, just before the fire. The fire, it seems, had fallen from its place, being of wood, and had taken hold of the boards and the joists they lay on, and burnt as far as just to the body, but had not taken hold of the dead body, though she had little more than her shift on, and had gone out of itself, not burning the rest of the house, though it was a slight timber house. How true this might be I do not determine, but the city being to suffer severely the next year by fire, this year it felt very little of that calamity. Indeed, considering the deliriums which the agony threw people into, and how I have mentioned in their madness, when they were alone, they did many desperate things, it was very strange there were no more disasters of that kind. It has frequently been asked me, and I cannot say that I ever knew how to give a direct answer to it, how it came to pass that so many infected people appeared abroad in the streets, at the same time that the houses which were infected were so vigilantly searched, and all of them shut up and guarded as they were. I confess I know not what answer to give to this, unless it be this, that in so great and populous a city as this is, it was impossible to discover every house that was infected as soon as it was so, or to shut up all the houses that were infected, so that people had the liberty of going about the streets, even where they pleased, unless they were known to belong to such and such infected houses. It is true, as several physicians told my Lord Mayor, the fury of the contagion was such at some particular times, and people sickened so fast and died so soon, that it was impossible, and indeed to no purpose, to go about to inquire who was sick and who was well, or to shut them up with such exactness as the thing required, almost every house in a whole street being infected, and in many places every person in some of the houses, and that which was still worse, by the time that the houses were known to be infected, most of the persons infected would be stone dead, and the rest run away for fear of being shut up, so that it was to very small purpose to call them infected houses, and shut them up, the infection having ravaged and taken its leave of the house before it was really known that the family was in any way touched. This may be sufficient to convince any reasonable person that it was not in the power of the magistrates, or of any human methods of policy, to prevent the spreading the infection, so that this way of shutting up houses was perfectly insufficient for that end. Indeed, it seemed to have no manner of public good in it, equal or proportionable to the grievous burden that it was to the particular families that were so shut up. And, as far as I was employed by the public in directing that severity, I frequently found occasion to see that it was incapable of answering the end. For example, as I was desired, as a visitor or examiner, to inquire into the particulars of several families which were infected, we scarce came to any house where the plague had visibly appeared in the family, but that some of the family were fled and gone. The magistrates would resent this, and charge the examiners with being remiss in their examination or inspection, but by that means houses were long infected before it was known. Now, as I was in this dangerous office but half the appointed time, which was 2 months, it was long enough to confirm myself that there were no way capable of coming at the knowledge of the true state of any family but by inquiring at the door or of the neighbours. As for going into every house to search, that was a part no authority would offer to impose on the inhabitants, or any citizen would undertake, for it would have been exposing us to certain infection and death, and to the ruin of our own families as well as of ourselves. Nor would any citizen of probity, and that could be depended upon, have stayed in the town if they had been made liable to such a severity. Seeing then that we could come at the certainty of things by no method but that of inquiry of the neighbours or of the family, and on that we could not justly depend, it was not possible but that the uncertainty of this matter would remain as above. It is true, masters of families were bound by the order to give notice to the examiner of the place where he lived, within 2 hours after he should discover it, of any person being sick in his house, that is to say, having signs of the infection. But they found so many ways to evade this, and excuse their negligence, that they seldom gave that notice till they had taken measures to have every one escape out of the house who had a mind to escape, whether they were sick or sound. And while this was so, it is easy to see that the shutting up of houses was no way to be depended upon as a sufficient method for putting a stop to the infection, because, as I have said elsewhere, many of those that so went out of those infected houses had the plague really upon them, though they might really think themselves sound. And some of these were the people that walked the streets till they fell down dead, not that they were suddenly struck with the distemper as with a bullet that killed with the stroke, but that they really had the infection in their blood long before, only that as it preyed secretly on the vitals, it appeared not till it seized the heart with a mortal power, and the patient died in a moment, as with a sudden fainting or an apoplectic fit. I know that some even of our physicians thought for a time that those people that so died in the streets were seized but that moment they fell, as if they had been touched by a stroke from heaven, as men are killed by a flash of lightning. But they found reason to alter their opinion afterward, for upon examining the bodies of such after they were dead, they always either had tokens upon them, or other evident proofs of the distemper having been longer upon them than they had otherwise expected. This often was the reason that, as I have said, we that were examiners were not able to come at the knowledge of the infection being entered into a house till it was too late to shut it up, and sometimes not till the people that were left were all dead. In Petticoat Lane 2 houses together were infected, and several people sick, but the distemper was so well concealed, the examiner, who was my neighbour, got no knowledge of it till notice was sent him that the people were all dead, and that the carts should call there to fetch them away. The 2 heads of the families concerted their measures, and so ordered their matters as that when the examiner was in the neighbourhood they appeared generally at a dime, and answered, that is, lied for one another, or got some of the neighbourhood to say they were all in health, and perhaps knew no better, till death making it impossible to keep it any longer as a secret, the dead carts were called in the night to both the houses, and so it became public. But when the examiner ordered the constable to shut up the houses, there was nobody left in them but 3 people, 2 in one house and 1 in the other, just dying, and a nurse in each house who acknowledged they had buried 5 before, that the houses had been infected 9 or 10 days, and that for all the rest of the 2 families, which were many, they were gone, some sick, some well, or whether sick or well could not be known. In like manner, at another house in the same lane, a man having his family infected, but very unwilling to be shut up, when he could conceal it no longer, shut up himself, that is to say, he set the great red cross upon his door with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," and so deluded the examiner, who supposed it had been done by the constable, by order of the other examiner, for there were 2 examiners to every district or precinct. By this means he had free egress and regress into his house again and out of it, as he pleased, notwithstanding it was infected, till at length his stratagem was found out, and then he, with the sound part of his servants and family, made off and escaped, so they were not shut up at all. These things made it hard, if not impossible, as I have said, to prevent the spreading of an infection by the shutting up of houses, unless the people would think the shutting of their houses no grievance, and be so willing to have it done as that they would give notice duly and faithfully to the magistrates of their being infected as soon as it was known by themselves. But as that cannot be expected from them, and the examiners cannot be supposed, as above, to go into their houses to visit and search, all the good of shutting up houses will be defeated, and few houses will be shut up in time, except those of the poor, who cannot conceal it, and of some people who will be discovered by the terror and consternation which the things put them into. I got myself discharged of the dangerous office I was in as soon as I could get another admitted, whom I had obtained for a little money to accept of it, and so, instead of serving the 2 months which I was directed, I was not above 3 weeks in it, and a great while too, considering it was in the month of August, at which time the distemper began to rage with great violence at our end of the town. In the execution of this office, I could not refrain speaking my opinion among my neighbours as to this shutting up the people in their houses, in which we saw most evidently the severities that were used, though grievous in themselves, had also this particular objection against them, namely, that they did not answer the end, as I have said, but that the distempered people went day by day about the streets, and it was our united opinion that a method to have removed the sound from the sick, in case of a particular house being visited, would have been much more reasonable on many accounts, leaving nobody with the sick persons but such as should on such occasion request to stay and declare themselves content to be shut up with them. Our scheme for removing those that were sound from those that were sick was only in such houses as were infected, and confining the sick was no confinement. Those that could not stir would not complain while they were in their senses, and while they had the power of judging. Indeed, when they came to be delirious and light-headed, then they would cry out of the cruelty of being confined. But for the removal of those that were well, we thought it highly reasonable and just, for their own sakes, they should be removed from the sick, and that for the other people's safety they should keep retired for a while, to see that they were sound, and might not infect others, and we thought 20 or 30 days enough for this. Now, certainly, if houses had been provided on purpose for those that were sound to perform this demi-quarantine in, they would have much less reason to think themselves injured in such a restraint than in being confined with infected people in the houses where they lived. It is here, however, to be observed that after the funerals became so many that people could not toll the bell, mourn or weep, or wear black for one another as they did before, no, nor so much as make coffins for those that died. So after a while the fury of the infection appeared to be so increased that, in short, they shut up no houses at all. It seemed enough that all the remedies of that kind had been used till they were found fruitless, and that the plague spread itself with such an irresistible fury, so that as the fire the succeeding year spread itself, and burned with such violence that the citizens in despair gave over their endeavours to extinguish it, so in the plague it came at last to such a violence that the people sat still looking at one another, and seemed quite abandoned to despair. Whole streets seemed to be desolated, and not to be shut up only, but to be emptied of their inhabitants. Doors were left open, windows stood shattering with the wind in empty houses for want of people to shut them. In a word, people began to give up themselves to their fears, and to think that all regulations and methods were in vain, and that there was nothing to be hoped for but an universal desolation. And it was even in the height of this general despair that it pleased God to stay his hand, and to slacken the fury of the contagion in such a manner as was even surprising, like its beginning, and demonstrated it to be his own particular hand, and that above, if not without the agency of means. I shall take notice of it in its proper place. But I must still speak of the plague as in its height, raging even to desolation, and the people under the most dreadful consternation, even as I have said, to despair. It is hardly credible to what excesses the passions of men carried them in this extremity of the distemper, and this part, I think, was as moving as the rest. What could affect a man in his full power of reflection, and what could make deeper impressions on the soul, than to see a man almost naked, and got out of his house, or perhaps out of his bed, into the street, and come out of Harrow Alley, a populous conjunction or collection of alleys, courts, and passages in the Butcher Row in Whitechapel, I say, what could be more affecting than to see this poor man come out into the open street, run dancing and singing and making 1,000 antic gestures, with 5 or 6 women and children running after him, crying and calling upon him for the Lord's sake to come back, and entreating the help of others to bring him back, but all in vain, nobody daring to lay a hand upon him or to come near him. This was a most grievous and afflicting thing to me, who saw it all from my own windows. For all this while the poor afflicted man was, as I observed it, even then in the utmost agony of pain, having, as they said, 2 swellings upon him which could not be brought to break or to suppurate. But by laying strong caustics on them, the surgeons had, it seems, hopes to break them, which caustics were then upon him, burning his flesh as with a hot iron. I cannot say what became of this poor man, but I think he continued roving about in that manner till he fell down dead. No wonder the aspect of the city itself was frightful. The usual concourse of people in the streets, and which used to be supplied from our end of the town, was abated. The exchange was not kept shut, indeed, but it was no more frequented. The fires were lost. They had been almost extinguished for some days by a very smart and hasty rain, but that was not all. Some of the physicians insisted that they were not only no benefit, but injurious to the people. This they made a loud clamour about, and complained to the Lord Mayor about it. On the other hand, others of the same faculty, and eminent too, opposed them, and gave their reasons why the fires were and must be useful to assuage the violence of the distemper. I cannot give a full account of their arguments on both sides, only this I remember, that they cavilled very much with one another. Some were for the fires, but that they must be made of wood, and not coal, and of particular sorts of wood too, such as fir in particular, or cedar, because of the strong effluvia of turpentine. Others were for coal, and not wood, because of the sulphur and bitumen, and others were for neither one or other. Upon the whole, the Lord Mayor ordered no more fires, and especially on this account, namely, that the plague was so fierce that they saw evidently it defied all means, and rather seemed to increase than decrease upon any application to check and abate it. And yet this amazement of the magistrates proceeded rather from want of being able to apply any means successfully, than from any unwillingness either to expose themselves or undertake the care and weight of business. For, to do them justice, they neither spared their pains nor their persons. But nothing answered. The infection raged, and the people were now frighted and terrified to the last degree, so that, as I may say, they gave themselves up, and, as I mentioned above, abandoned themselves to their despair. But let me observe here, that when I say the people abandoned themselves to despair, I do not mean what men call a religious despair, or a despair of their eternal state, but I mean a despair of their being able to escape the infection, or to outlive the plague, which they saw was so raging and so irresistible in its force, that indeed few people that were touched with it in its height, about August and September, escaped, and which is very particular, contrary to its ordinary operation in June and July, and the beginning of August, when, as I have observed, many were infected, and continued so many days, and then went off after having had the poison in their blood a long time. But now, on the contrary, most of the people who were taken during the 2 last weeks in August, and in the first 3 weeks in September, generally died in 2 or 3 days at furthest, and many the very same day they were taken, whether the dog days, or, as our astrologers pretended to express themselves, the influence of the dog's star had that malignant effect, or all those who had the seeds of infection before in them brought it up to a maturity at that time altogether, I know not, but this was the time when it was reported that above 3,000 people died in one night, and they that would have us believe they more critically observed it, pretend to say that they all died within the space of 2 hours, that is, between the hours of 1 and 3 in the morning. End of section 17. Of A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dennis Sayers. Section 18. As to the suddenness of people's dying at this time, more than before, there were innumerable instances of it, and I could name several in my neighbourhood. One family, without the bars, were all seemingly well on the Monday, being 10 in family. That evening 1 maid and 1 apprentice were taken ill and died the next morning, when the other apprentice and 2 children were touched, whereof 1 died the same evening, and the other 2 on Wednesday. In a word, by Saturday at noon, the master, mistress, 4 children, and 4 servants were all gone, and the house left entirely empty, except an ancient woman who came in to take charge of the goods for the master of the family's brother, who lived not far off, and who had not been sick. Many houses were then left desolate, all the people being carried away dead, and especially in an alley farther on the same side behind the bars, going in at the sign of Moses and Aaron, there were several houses together which, they said, had not 1 person left alive in them, and some that died last in several of those houses were left a little too long before they were fetched out to be buried, the reason of which was not, as some have written very untruly, that the living were not sufficient to bury the dead, but that the mortality was so great in the yard or alley that there was nobody left to give notice to the buriers or sextons that there were any dead bodies there to be buried. It was said, how true I know not, that some of those bodies were so much corrupted and so rotten that it was with difficulty they were carried, and as the carts could not come any nearer than to the alley gate in the High Street, it was so much the more difficult to bring them along. But I am not certain how many bodies were then left. I am sure that ordinarily it was not so. As I have mentioned how the people were brought into a condition to despair of life and abandon themselves, so this very thing had a strange effect among us for 3 or 4 weeks. That is, it made them bold and venturous. They were no more shy of one another, or restrained within doors, but went anywhere and everywhere, and began to converse. One would say to another, "I do not ask you how you are, or say how I am. I am certain we shall all go, so 'tis no matter who is all sick or who is sound." And so they ran desperately into any place or any company. As it brought the people into public company, so it was surprising how it brought them to crowd into the churches. They inquired no more into whom they sat near to, or far from, what offensive smells they met with, or what condition the people seemed to be in, but, looking upon themselves all as so many dead corpses, they came to the churches without the least caution, and crowded together as if their lives were of no consequence to the work which they came about there. Indeed, the zeal which they showed in coming, and the earnestness and affection they showed in their attention to what they heard, made it manifest what a value people would all put upon the worship of God, if they thought every day they attended at the church that it would be their last. Nor was it without other strange effects, for it took away all manner of prejudice at or scruple about the person whom they found in the pulpit when they came to the churches. It cannot be doubted but that many of the ministers of the parish churches were cut off, among others, in so common and dreadful a calamity, and others had not courage enough to stand it, but removed into the country as they found means for an escape. As then some parish churches were quite vacant and forsaken, the people made no scruple of desiring such dissenters as had been a few years before deprived of their livings by virtue of the Act of Parliament, called the Act of Uniformity, to preach in the churches, nor did the church ministers, in that case, make any difficulty of accepting their assistance, so that many of those whom they called silenced ministers had their mouths opened on this occasion, and preached publicly to the people. Here we may observe, and I hope it will not be amiss to take notice of it, that a near view of death would soon reconcile men of good principles one to another, and that it is chiefly owing to our easy situation in life, and our putting these things far from us, that our breaches are fomented, ill blood continued, prejudices, breach of charity, and of Christian union, so much kept and so far carried on among us as it is. Another plague year would reconcile all these differences. A close conversing with death, or with diseases that threaten death, would scum off the gall from our tempers, remove the animosities among us, and bring us to see with differing eyes than those which we looked on things with before. As the people who had been used to join with the church were reconciled at this time with the admitting of the dissenters to preach to them, so the dissenters, who with an uncommon prejudice had broken off from the communion of the Church of England, were now content to come to their parish churches, and to conform to the worship which they did not approve of before. But as the terror of the infection abated, those things all returned again to their less desirable channel, and to the course they were in before. I mention this but historically. I have no mind to enter into arguments to move either or both sides to a more charitable compliance one with another. I do not see that it is probable such a discourse would be either suitable or successful. The breaches seem rather to widen, and tend to a widening further than to closing, and who am I that I should think myself able to influence either one side or other? But this I may repeat again, that 'tis evident death will reconcile us all. On the other side the grave we shall all be brethren again. In heaven, whither I hope we may come from all parties and persuasions, we shall find neither prejudice or scruple. There we shall be of one principle and of one opinion. why we cannot be content to go hand in hand to the place where we shall join heart and hand without the least hesitation, and with the most complete harmony and affection. I say, why we cannot do so here, I can say nothing to, neither shall I say anything more of it, but that it remains to be lamented. I could dwell a great while upon the calamities of this dreadful time, and go on to describe the objects that appeared among us every day, the dreadful extravagancies which the distraction of sick people drove them into, how the streets began now to be fuller of frightful objects, and families to be made even a terror to themselves. But after I have told you, as I have above, that one man, being tied in his bed, and finding no other way to deliver himself, set the bed on fire with his candle, which unhappily stood within his reach, and burnt himself in his bed; and how another, by the insufferable torment he bore, danced and sung naked in the streets, not knowing one ecstasy from another. I say, after I have mentioned these things, what can be added more? What can be said to represent the misery of these times more lively to the reader, or to give him a more perfect idea of a complicated distress? I must acknowledge that this time was terrible, that I was sometimes at the end of all my resolutions, and that I had not the courage that I had at the beginning. As the extremity brought other people abroad, it drove me home, and except having made my voyage down to Blackwall and Greenwich, as I have related, which was an excursion, I kept afterwards very much within doors, as I had for about a fortnight before. I have said already that I repented several times that I had ventured to stay in town, and had not gone away with my brother and his family, but it was too late for that now; and after I had retreated and stayed within doors a good while before my impatience led me abroad, then they called me, as I have said, to an ugly and dangerous office which brought me out again; but as that was expired while the height of the distemper lasted, I retired again, and continued close 10 or 12 days more, during which many dismal spectacles represented themselves in my view out of my own windows and in our own street, as that particularly from Harrow Alley, of the poor outrageous creature which danced and sung in his agony, and many others there were. Scarce a day or a night passed over, but some dismal thing or other happened at the end of that Harrow Alley, which was a place full of poor people, most of them belonging to the butchers, or to employments depending upon the butchery. Sometimes heaps and throngs of people would burst out of the alley, most of them women, making a dreadful clamour, mixed or compounded of screeches, cryings, and calling one another, that we could not conceive what to make of it. Almost all the dead part of the night the dead cart stood at the end of that alley, for if it went in it could not well turn again, and could go in but a little way. There, I say, it stood to receive dead bodies, and as the churchyard was but a little way off, if it went away full, it would soon be back again. It is impossible to describe the most horrible cries and noise the poor people would make at their bringing the dead bodies of their children and friends out of the cart, and by the number one would have thought there had been none left behind, or that there were people enough for a small city living in those places. Several times they cried murder, sometimes fire, but it was easy to perceive it was all distraction, and the complaints of distressed and distempered people. I believe it was everywhere thus at this time, for the plague raged for 6 or 7 weeks beyond all that I have expressed, and came even to such a height that, in the extremity, they began to break into that excellent order of which I have spoken so much in behalf of the magistrates, namely, that no dead bodies were seen in the street, or burials in the daytime, for there was a necessity, in this extremity, to bear with its being otherwise for a little while. One thing I cannot omit here, and indeed I thought it was extraordinary, at least it seemed a remarkable hand of divine justice, that is, that all the predictors, astrologers, fortune-tellers, and what they call cunning men, conjurers, and the like, calculators of nativities and dreamers of dream, and such people, were gone and vanished. Not one of them was to be found. I am verily persuaded that a great number of them fell in the heat of the calamity, having ventured to stay upon the prospect of getting great estates, and indeed their gain was but too great for a time, through the madness and folly of the people. But now they were silent. Many of them went to their long home, not able to foretell their own fate or to calculate their own nativities. Some have been critical enough to say that every one of them died. I dare not affirm that, but this I must own, that I never heard of one of them that ever appeared after the calamity was over. But to return to my particular observations during this dreadful part of the visitation, I am now come, as I have said, to the month of September, which was the most dreadful of its kind, I believe, that ever London saw. For by all the accounts which I have seen of the preceding visitations which have been in London, nothing has been like it, the number in the weekly bill amounting to almost 40,000 from the 22nd of August to the 26th of September, being but 5 weeks. The particulars of the bills are as follows, viz., from August the 22nd to the 29th, 7,496. From August the 29th to the 5th of September, 8,252. From September the 5th through the 12th, 7,690. From September the 12th through the 19th, 8,297. From September the 19th through the 26th, 6,460, for a total of 38,195. This was a prodigious number of itself, but I should add the reasons which I had to believe that the account was deficient, and how deficient it was, you would, with me, make no scruple to believe that there died above 10,000 a week for all those weeks, one week with another, and a proportion for several weeks both before and after. The confusion among the people, especially within the city at that same time, was inexpressible. The terror was so great at last that the courage of the people appointed to carry away the dead began to fail them. Nay, several of them died, although they had the distemper before and were recovered, and some of them dropped dead when they had been carrying the bodies even at the pit side, and just ready to throw them in. And this confusion was greater in the city, because they had flattered themselves with hopes of escaping, and thought the bitterness of death was past. One cart, they told us, going up Shoreditch was forsaken of the drivers, or being left to one man to drive, he died in the street, and the horses going on overthrew the cart, and left the bodies some thrown out here, some there, in a dismal manner. Another cart was, it seems, found in the great pit in Finsbury Fields, the driver being dead, or having been gone and abandoned it, and the horses running too near it, the cart fell in and drew the horses in also. It was suggested that the driver was thrown in with it, and that the cart fell upon him, by reason his whip was seen to be in the pit among the bodies, but that, I suppose, could not be certain. In our parish of Aldgate the dead carts were several times, as I have heard, found standing at the churchyard gate, full of dead bodies, but neither bellman or driver or any one else with it. Neither in these or many other cases did they know what bodies they had in their cart, for sometimes they were let down with ropes out of balconies and out of windows, and sometimes the bearers brought them to the cart, sometimes other people. Nor, as the men themselves said, did they trouble themselves to keep any account of the numbers. The vigilance of the magistrates was now put to the utmost trial, and it must be confessed can never be enough acknowledged on this occasion also. Whatever expense or trouble they were at, two things were never neglected in the city or suburbs either. 1. Provisions were always to be had in full plenty, and the price not much raised neither, hardly worth speaking. 2. No dead bodies lay unburied or uncovered, and if one walked from one end of the city to another, no funeral or sign of it was to be seen in the daytime, except a little, as I have said above, in the first 3 weeks in September. This last article will hardly be believed when some accounts which others have published since that shall be seen, wherein they say that the dead lay unburied, which I am assured was utterly false. At least, if it had been anywhere so, it must have been in houses where the living were gone from the dead, having found means, as I have observed, to escape, and where no notice was given to the officers. All which amounts to nothing at all in the case in hand, for this I am positive in, having been employed a little in the direction of that part in the parish in which I lived, and where as great a desolation was made in proportion to the number of inhabitants as was anywhere. I say, I am sure that there were no dead bodies remained unburied, that is to say, none that the proper officers knew of, none for want of people to carry them off, and barriers to put them into the ground and cover them, and this is sufficient to the argument, for what might lie in houses and holes, as in Moses and Aaron alley, is nothing, for it is most certain they were buried as soon as they were found. As to the first article, namely of provisions, the scarcity or dearness, though I have mentioned it before and shall speak of it again, yet I must observe here, first, the price of bread in particular was not much raised, for in the beginning of the year, that is, in the first week in March, the penny wheaten loaf was 10 ounces and a half, and in the height of the contagion it was to be had at 9 ounces and a half, and never dearer, no, not all that season. And about the beginning of November it was sold 10 ounces and a half again, the like of which I believe was never heard of in any city under so dreadful a visitation before. Second, neither was there, which I wondered much at, any want of bakers or ovens kept open to supply the people with the bread, but this was indeed alleged by some families, that is, that their maid-servants, going to the bake-houses with their dough to be baked, which was then the custom, sometimes came home with the sickness, that is to say, the plague, upon them. In all this dreadful visitation there were, as I have said before, but 2 pest houses made use of, that is, one in the fields beyond Old Street, and one in Westminster. Neither was there any compulsion used in carrying people thither. Indeed, there was no need of compulsion in the case, for there were many thousands of poor and distressed people, who, having no help or conveniences or supplies but of charity, would have been very glad to have been carried thither and been taken care of, which indeed was the only thing that I think was wanting in the whole public management of the city, seeing nobody was here allowed to be brought to the pest house but where money was given, or security for money, either at their introducing or upon their being cured and sent out. For very many were sent out again whole, and very good physicians were appointed to those places, so that many people did very well there, of which I shall make mention again. The principal sort of people sent thither were, as I have said, servants who got the distemper by going of errands to fetch necessaries to the families where they lived, and who in that case, if they came home sick, were removed to preserve the rest of the house, and they were so well looked after there, in all the time of the visitation, that there was but 156 buried in all at the London pest house, and 159 at that of Westminster. By having more pest houses, I am far from meaning a forcing all people into such places. Had the shutting up of houses been omitted, and the sick hurried out of their dwellings to pest houses, as some proposed, it seems, at that time as well as since, it would certainly have been much worse than it was. The very removing the sick would have been a spreading of the infection, and this rather because that removing could not effectually clear the house where the sick person was of the distemper, and the rest of the family, being then left at liberty, would certainly spread it among others. The methods also in private families, which would have been universally used to have concealed the distemper and to have concealed the persons being sick, would have been such that the distemper would sometimes have seized a whole family before any visitors or examiners could have known it. On the other hand, the prodigious numbers which would have been sick at a time would have exceeded all the capacity of public pest houses to receive them, or of public officers to discover and remove them. This was well considered in those days, and I have heard them talk of it often. The magistrates had enough to do to bring people to submit to having their houses shut up, and many ways they deceived the watchmen and got out, as I have observed. But that difficulty made it apparent that they would have found it impracticable to have gone the other way to work, for they could never have forced the sick people out of their beds and out of their dwellings. It must not have been my Lord Mayor's officers, but an army of officers, that must have attempted it, and the people, on the other hand, would have been enraged and desperate, and would have killed those that should have offered to have meddled with them or with their children and relations, whatever had befallen them for it, so that they would have made the people, who, as it was, were in the most terrible distraction imaginable, I say, they would have made them stark mad, whereas the magistrates found it proper, on several accounts, to treat them with lenity and compassion, and not with violence and terror, such as dragging the sick out of their houses, or obliging them to remove themselves, would have been. This leads me again to mention the time when the plague first began, that is to say, when it became certain that it would spread over the whole town, when, as I have said, the better sort of people first took the alarm and began to hurry themselves out of town. It was true, as I observed in its place, that the throng was so great, and the coaches, horses, wagons, and carts were so many, driving and dragging the people away, that it looked as if all the city was running away. And had any regulations been published that had been terrifying at that time, especially such as would pretend to dispose of the people otherwise than they would dispose of themselves, it would have put both the city and suburbs into the utmost confusion. End of section 18. Of A Journal from the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dennis Sayers. Section 19. But the magistrates wisely caused the people to be encouraged, made very good bylaws for the regulating of the citizens, keeping good order in the streets, and making everything as eligible as possible to all sorts of people. In the first place, the Lord Mayor and the sheriffs, the court of aldermen, and a certain number of the common councilmen or their deputies, came to a resolution and published it, viz., that they would not quit the city themselves, but that they would be always at hand for the preserving good order in every place, and for the doing justice on all occasions, as also for the distributing the public charity to the poor, and, in a word, for the doing the duty and discharging the trust reposed in them by the citizens to the utmost of their power. In pursuance of these orders, the Lord Mayor, sheriffs, etc., held councils every day, more or less, for making such dispositions as they found needful for preserving the civil peace. And though they used the people with all possible gentleness and clemency, yet all manner of presumptuous rogues, such as thieves, housebreakers, plunderers of the dead or of the sick, were duly punished, and several declarations were continually published by the Lord Mayor and court of aldermen against such. Also, all constables and churchwardens were enjoined to stay in the city upon severe penalties, or to depute such able and sufficient housekeepers as the deputy aldermen or common councilmen of the precinct should approve, and for whom they should give security, and also security in case of mortality, that they would forthwith constitute other constables in their stead. These things re-established the minds of the people very much, especially in the first of their fright, when they talked of making so universal a flight that the city would have been in danger of being entirely deserted of its inhabitants except the poor, and the country of being plundered and laid waste by the multitude. Nor were the magistrates deficient in performing their part as bodily as they promised it, for my Lord Mayor and the sheriffs were continually in the streets and at places of the greatest danger, and though they did not care for having too great a resort of people crowding about them, yet in emergent cases they never denied the people access to them, and heard with patience all their grievances and complaints. My Lord Mayor had a low gallery built on purpose in his hall, where he stood a little removed from the crowd when any complaint came to be heard, that he might appear with as much safety as possible. Likewise the proper officers, called my Lord Mayor's officers, constantly attended in their turns, as they were in waiting. And if any of them were sick or infected, as some of them were, others were instantly employed to fill up and officiate in their places till it was known whether the others should live or die. In like manner the sheriffs and aldermen did in their several stations and wards, where they were placed by office, and the sheriff's officers or sergeants
were appointed to receive orders from the respective aldermen in their turn, so that justice was executed in all cases without interruption. In the next place, it was one of their particular cares to see the orders for the freedom of the markets observed, and in this part either the Lord Mayor or one or both of the sheriffs were every market day on horseback to see their orders executed, and to see that the country people had all possible encouragement and freedom in their coming to the markets and going back again, and that no nuisances or frightful objects should be seen in the streets to terrify them or make them unwilling to come. Also, the bakers were taken under particular order, and the master of the bakers' company was, with his court of assistants, directed to see the order of my mayor for their regulation put in execution, and the due assize of bread which was weekly appointed by my Lord Mayor observed, and all the bakers were obliged to keep their oven going constantly, on pain of losing the privileges of a freeman of the city of London. By this means bread was always to be had in plenty, and as cheap as usual, as I said above, and provisions were never wanting in the markets, even to such a degree that I often wondered at it, and reproached myself with being so timorous and cautious in stirring abroad, when the country people came freely and boldly to market, as if there had been no manner of infection in the city, or danger of catching it. It was indeed one admirable piece of conduct in the said magistrates, that the streets were kept constantly clear, and free from all manner of frightful objects, dead bodies, or any such things as were indecent or unpleasant, unless where anybody fell down suddenly or died in the streets, as I have said above, and these were generally covered with some cloth or blanket, or removed into the next churchyard till night. All the needful works that carried terror with them, that were both dismal and dangerous, were done in the night. If any diseased bodies were removed, or dead bodies buried, or infected clothes burnt, it was done in the night. And all the bodies which were thrown into the great pits in the several churchyards or burying grounds, as has been observed, were so removed in the night, and everything was covered and closed before day, so that in the daytime there was not the least signal of the calamity to be seen or heard of, except what was to be observed from the emptiness of the streets, and sometimes from the passionate outcries and lamentations of the people out at their windows, and from the numbers of houses and shops shut up. Nor was the silence and emptiness of the streets so much in the city as in the outparts, except just at one particular time when, as I have mentioned, the plague came east and spread over all the city. It was indeed a merciful disposition of God that as the plague began at one end of the town first, as has been observed at large, so it proceeded progressively to other parts, and did not come on this way, or eastward, till it had spent its fury in the west part of the town. And so, as it came on one way, it abated another. For example, it began at St. Giles in the Westminster end of the town, and it was in its height in all that part by about the middle of July, viz., in St. Giles in the Fields, St. Andrews, Holborn, St. Clement Danes, St. Martin in the Fields, and in Westminster. The latter end of July it decreased in those parishes, and coming east, it increased prodigiously in Cripplegate, St. Sepulchre's, St. James, Clerkenwell, and St. Bride's and Aldersgate. While it was in all these parishes, the city and all the parishes of the Southwark side of the water, and all Stepney, Whitechapel, Aldgate, Wapping, and Radcliffe were very little touched, so that people went about their business unconcerned, carried on their trades, kept open their shops, and conversed freely with one another in all the city, the east and north-east suburbs, and in Southwark, almost as if the plague had not been among us. Even when the north and north-west suburbs were fully infected, viz. Cripplegate, Clerkenwell, Bishopsgate, and Shoreditch, yet all the rest were tolerably well. For example, from 25th July to 1st August, the bill stood thus of all diseases: St. Giles, Cripplegate, 554; St. Sepulchre's, 250; Clerkenwell, 103; Bishopsgate, 116; Shoreditch, 110; Stepney Parish, 127; Aldgate, 92; Whitechapel, 104; all the 97 parishes within the walls, 228; all the parishes in Southwark, 205; totaling 1,889. So that, in short, there died more that week in the two parishes of Cripplegate and St. Sepulchre's by 48 than all the city, all the east suburbs, and all the Southwark parishes put together. This caused the reputation of the city's health to continue all over England, and especially in the counties and markets adjacent, from whence our supply of provisions chiefly came, even much longer than that health itself continued. For when the people came into the streets from the country, by Shoreditch and Bishopsgate, or by Old Street and Smithfield, they would see the outstreets empty, and the houses and shops shut, and the few people that were stirring there walk in the middle of the streets. But when they came within the city, there things looked better, and the markets and shops were open, and the people walking about the streets as usual, though not quite so many, and this continued till the latter end of August and the beginning of September. But then the case altered quite. The distemper abated in the west and north-west parishes, and the weight of the infection lay on the city and the eastern suburbs, and the Southwark side, and this in a frightful manner. Then, indeed, the city began to look dismal, shops to be shut, and the streets desolate. In the High Street, indeed, necessity made people stir abroad on many occasions, and there would be in the middle of the day a pretty many people, but in the mornings and evenings scarce any to be seen even there, no, not in Cornhill and Cheapside. These observations of mine were abundantly confirmed by the weekly bills of mortality for those weeks, an abstract of which, as they respect the parishes which I have mentioned, and as they make the calculations I speak of very evident, take as follows. The weekly bill which makes out this decrease of the burials in the west and north side of the city stands thus: St. Giles, Cripplegate, 456; St. Giles in the Fields, 140; Clerkenwell, 77; St. Sepulchre's, 214; St. Leonard, Shoreditch, 183; Stepney Parish, 716; Aldgate, 629; Whitechapel, 532; in the 97 parishes within the walls, 1,493; in the 8 parishes on the Southwark side, 1,636, totaling 6,076. Here is a strange change of things indeed, and a sad change it was. and had it held for 2 months more than it did, very few people would have been left alive. But then such, I say, was the merciful disposition of God, that when it was thus, the west and north part, which had been so dreadfully visited at first, grew, as you see, much better, and as the people disappeared here, they began to look abroad again there, and the next week or two altered it still more, that is, more to the encouragement of the other part of town. For example, September 19th through 26th, St. Giles, Cripplegate, 277. St. Giles in the Field, 119. Clerkenwell, 76. St. Sepulchre's, 193. St. Leonard, Shoreditch, 146. Stepney Parish, 616. Aldgate, 496. Whitechapel, 346. In the 97 parishes within the walls, 1,268. In the 8 parishes on Southwark side, 1,390, totaling 4,927. September 26th through October 3rd. St. Giles, Cripplegate, 196. St. Giles in the Fields, 95. Clerkenwell, 48. St. Sepulchre's, 137. St. Leonard, Shoreditch, 128. Stepney Parish, 674. Aldgate, 372. Whitechapel, 328. In the 97 parishes within the walls, 1,149. In the 8 parishes on the Southwark side, 4,328. And now the misery of the city, and of the said east and south parts, was complete indeed, for as you see, the weight of the distemper lay upon those parts, that is to say, the city, the 8 parishes over the river, and with the parishes of Aldgate, Whitechapel, and Stepney. And this was the time that the bills came up to such a monstrous height as that I mentioned before, and that 8 or 9, and, as I believe, 10 or 12,000 a week died. For it is my settled opinion that they never could come at any just account of the numbers, for the reasons which I have given already. Nay, one of the most eminent physicians, who has since published in Latin an account of those times and of his observations, says that in 1 week there died 12,000 people, and that, particularly, there died 4,000 in 1 night, though I do not remember that there ever was any such particular night so remarkably fatal as that such a number died in it. However, all this confirms what I have said above of the uncertainty of the bills of mortality, etc., of which I shall say more hereafter. And here let me take leave to enter again, though it may seem a repetition of circumstances, into a description of the miserable condition of the city itself, and of those parts where I lived at this particular time. The city and those other parts, notwithstanding the great numbers of people that were gone into the country, was vastly full of people, and perhaps the fuller because people had for a long time a strong belief that the plague would not come into the city, nor into Southwark, no, nor into Wapping or Radcliffe at all. Nay, such was the assurance of the people on that head, that many removed from the suburbs on the west and north sides into those eastern and south sides as for safety, and, as I verily believe, carried the plague amongst them there, perhaps sooner than they would otherwise have had it. Here, also, I ought to leave a further remark for the use of posterity, concerning the manner of people's infecting one another, namely, that it was not the sick people only from whom the plague was immediately received by others that were sound, but the well. To explain myself, by the sick people I mean those who were known to be sick, had taken their beds, had been under cure, or had swellings or tumours upon them, and the like. These everybody could beware of. They were either in their beds or in such condition as could not be concealed. By the well I mean such as had received the contagion, and had it really upon them and in their blood, yet did not show the consequences of it in their countenances, nay, even were not sensible of it themselves, as many were not for several days. These breathed death in every place, and upon everybody who came near them. Nay, their very clothes retained the infection. Their hands would infect the things they touched, especially if they were warm and sweaty, and they were generally apt to sweat too. Now, it was impossible to know these people, nor did they sometimes, as I have said, know themselves to be infected. These were the people that so often dropped down and fainted in the streets, for oftentimes they would go about the streets to the last, till, on a sudden, they would sweat, grow faint, sit down at a door, and die. It is true, finding themselves thus, they would struggle hard to get home to their own doors, or at other times would be just able to go into their houses, and die instantly. Other times they would go about till they had the very tokens come out upon them, and yet not know it, and would die in an hour or two after they came home, but be well as long as they were abroad. These were the dangerous people. These were the people of whom the well people ought to have been afraid. But then, on the other side, it was impossible to know them. And this is the reason why it is impossible in a visitation to prevent the spreading of the plague by the utmost human vigilance, viz., that it is impossible to know the infected people from the sound, or that the infected people should perfectly know themselves. I knew a man who conversed freely in London all the season of the plague in 1665, and kept about him an antidote or cordial on purpose, to take when he thought himself in any danger, and he had such a rule to know or have warning of the danger by, as indeed I never met with before or since. How far it may be depended on, I know not. He had a wound in his leg, and whenever he came among any people that were not sound, and the infection began to affect him, he said he could know it by that signal, viz., that the wound in his leg would smart, and look pale and white. So as soon as ever he felt it smart, it was time for him to withdraw, or to take care of himself, taking his drink, which he always carried about him for that purpose. Now, it seems, he found his wound would smart many times when he was in company with such who thought themselves to be sound, and who appeared so to one another, but he would presently rise up and say publicly, "Friends, here is somebody in the room that has the plague," and so would immediately break up the company. This was indeed a faithful monitor to all people, that the plague is not to be avoided by those that converse promiscuously in a town infected, and people have it when they know it not, and that they likewise give it to others when they know not that they have it themselves. And in this case, shutting up the well or removing the sick will not do it, unless they can go back and shut up all those that the sick had conversed with, even before they knew themselves to be sick, and none knows how far to carry that back, or where to stop, for none knows when, or where, or how they may have received the infection, or from whom. This I take to be the reason which makes so many people talk of the air being corrupted and infected, and that they need not be cautious of whom they converse with, for that the contagion was in the air. I have seen them in strange agitations and surprises on this account. I have never come near any infected body, says the disturbed person. I have conversed with none but sound, healthy people, and yet I have gotten the distemper. I am sure I am struck from heaven, says another, and he falls to the serious part. Again the first goes on exclaiming, I have come near no infection or any infected person. I am sure it is in the air. We draw in death when we breathe, and therefore it is the hand of God. There is no withstanding it. And this at last made many people, being hardened to the danger, grow less concerned at it, and less cautious towards the latter end of the time, and when it was come to its height, than they were at first. Then with a kind of a Turkish predestinarianism, they would say, if it pleased God to strike them, it was all one whether they went abroad or stayed at home. They could not escape it, and therefore they went boldly about, even into infected houses and infected company, visited sick people, and, in short, lay in the beds with their wives or relations when they were infected. And what was the consequence? But the same that is the consequence in Turkey, and in those countries where they do those things, namely, that they were infected too, and died by hundreds and thousands.
End of section 19. A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 20. I would be far from lessening the awe of the judgments of God and the reverence to his providence which ought always to be on our minds on such occasions as these. Doubtless the visitation itself is a stroke from heaven upon a city, country, or nation where it falls, a messenger of his vengeance, and a loud call to that nation or country or city to humiliation and repentance, according to that of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 18, verses 7 and 8. Quote, At what instant I shall speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to pluck up and to pull down and to destroy it. If that nation against whom I have pronounced turn from their evil, I will repent of the evil that I thought to do unto them. Close quote. Now, to prompt due impressions of the awe of God on the minds of men on such occasions, and not to lessen them, it is that I have left those minutes upon record. I say, therefore, I reflect upon no man for putting the reason of those things upon the immediate hand of God, and the appointment and direction of his providence. Nay, on the contrary, there were many wonderful deliverances of persons from infection, and deliverances of persons when infected, which intimate singular and remarkable providence in the particular instances to which they refer. And I esteem my own deliverance to be one next to miraculous, and do record it with thankfulness. But when I am speaking of the plague as a distemper arising from natural causes, we must consider it as it was really propagated by natural means, nor is it at all the less a judgment for its being under the conduct of human causes and effects. For, as the divine power has formed the whole scheme of nature, and maintains nature in its course, so the same power thinks fit to let his own actings with men, whether of mercy or judgment, to go on in the ordinary course of natural causes, and he is pleased to act by those natural causes as the ordinary means, excepting and reserving to himself, nevertheless, a power to act in a supernatural way when he sees occasion. Now, 'tis evident that in the case of an infection there is no apparent extraordinary occasion for supernatural operation, but the ordinary course of things appears sufficiently armed, and made capable of all the effects that Heaven usually directs by a contagion. Among these causes and effects, this of the secret conveyance of infection, imperceptible and unavoidable, is more than sufficient to execute the fierceness of divine vengeance without putting it upon supernaturals and miracle.
The acute penetrating nature of the disease itself was such, and the infection was received so imperceptibly, that the most exact caution could not secure us while in the place. But I must be allowed to believe, and I have so many examples fresh in my memory to convince me of it, that I think none can resist their evidence. I say, I must be allowed to believe that no one in this whole nation ever received the sickness or infection, but who received it in the ordinary way of infection from somebody, or the clothes, or touch, or stench of somebody that was infected before. The manner of its coming first to London proves this also, viz., by goods brought over from Holland, and brought thither from the Levant, the first breaking of it out in a house in Long Acre, where those goods were carried, and first opened, it spreading from that house to other houses by the visible unwary conversing with those who were sick, and the infecting the parish officers who were employed about the persons dead, and the like. These are known authorities for this great foundation point, that it went on and proceeded from person to person, and from house to house, and no otherwise. In the first house that was infected there died 4 persons. A neighbour, hearing the mistress of the first house was sick, went to visit her, and went home and gave the distemper to her family, and died, and all her household. A minister, called to pray with the first sick person in the second house, was said to sicken immediately, and die with several more in his house. Then the physicians began to consider, for they did not at first dream of a general contagion. But the physicians being sent to inspect the bodies, they assured the people that it was neither more or less than the plague, with all its terrifying particulars, and that it threatened an universal infection, so many people having already conversed with the sick or distempered, and having, as might be supposed, received infection from them, that it would be impossible to put a stop to it. Here the opinion of the physicians agreed with my observations afterwards, namely that the danger was spreading insensibly, for the sick could infect none but those that came within reach of the sick person, but that one man who may have really received the infection and knows it not, but goes abroad and about as a sound person, may give the plague to 1,000 people, and they to greater numbers in proportion, and neither the person giving the infection or the persons receiving it know anything of it, and perhaps not feel the effects of it for several days after. For example, many persons in the time of this visitation never perceived that they were infected till they found, to their unspeakable surprise, the tokens come out upon them, after which they seldom lived 6 hours, for these spots they called the tokens were really gangrene spots, or mortified flesh in small knobs as broad as a little silver penny, and hard as a piece of callus or horn, so that when the disease was come up to that length, there was nothing could follow but certain death, and yet, as I said, they knew nothing of their being infected, nor found themselves so much as out of order, till those mortal marks were upon them. But everybody must allow that they were infected in a high degree before, and must have been so some time, and consequently their breath, their sweat, their very clothes were contagious for many days before. This occasioned a vast variety of cases which physicians would have much more opportunity to remember than I, but some came within the compass of my observation or hearing, of which I shall name a few. A certain citizen who had lived safe and untouched till the month of September, when the weight of the distemper lay more in the city than it had done before, was mighty cheerful, and something too bold, as I think it was, in his talk of how secure he was, how cautious he had been, and how he had never come near any sick body. Says another citizen, a neighbour of his, to him one day, "Do not be too confident, Mr. Blank. It is hard to say who is sick and who is well, for we see men alive and well to outward appearance 1 hour, and dead the next." "That is true," says the first man, for he was not a man presumptuously secure, but had escaped a long while, and men, as I said above, especially in the city, began to be over-easy upon that score. "That is true," says he. "I do not think myself secure, but I hope I have not been in company with any person that there has been any danger in." "No," says his neighbour. "Was not that you at the Bullhead Tavern in Gracechurch Street with Mr. Dash the night before last?" "Yes," says the first, "I was, but there was nobody there that we had any reason to think dangerous." Upon which his neighbour said no more, being unwilling to surprise him. But this made him more inquisitive, and as his neighbour appeared backward, he was the more impatient, and in a kind of warmth says he aloud, "Why, he is not dead, is he?" Upon which his neighbour still was silent, but cast up his eyes and said something to himself, at which the first citizen turned pale, and said no more but this, "Then I am a dead man too," and went home immediately and sent for a neighbouring apothecary to give him something preventive, for he had not yet found himself ill. But the apothecary, opening his breast, fetched a sigh, and said no more but this, "Look up to God," and the man died in a few hours. Now let any man judge from a case like this, if it is possible for the regulations of magistrates, either by shutting up the sick or removing them, to stop an infection which spreads itself from man to man even while they are perfectly well, and insensible of its approach, and may be so for many days. It may be proper to ask here, how long it may be supposed men might have the seeds of the contagion in them before it discovered itself in this fatal manner, and how long they might go about seemingly whole, and yet be contagious to all those that came near them. I believe the most experienced physicians cannot answer this question directly, any more than I can, and something an ordinary observer may take notice of, which may pass their observations. The opinion of physicians abroad seems to be that it may lie dormant in the spirits or in the blood vessels a very considerable time. Why else do they exact a quarantine of those who came into their harbours and ports from suspected places? 40 days is, one would think, too long for nature to struggle with such an enemy as this, and not conquer it or yield to it. But I could not think, by my own observation, that they can be infected so as to be contagious to others above 15 or 16 days at furthest, and on that score it was that when a house was shut up in the city, and any one had died of the plague, but nobody appeared to be ill in the family for 16 or 18 days after, they were not so strict but that they would connive at their going privately abroad, nor would people be much afraid of them afterward, but rather think they were fortified the better, having not been vulnerable when the enemy was in their own house. But we sometimes found it had lain much longer concealed. Upon the foot of all these observations, I must say, that though Providence seemed to direct my conduct to be otherwise, yet it is my opinion, and I must leave it as a prescription, viz., that the best physic against the plague is to run away from it. I know people encourage themselves by saying God is able to keep us in the midst of danger, and able to overtake us when we think ourselves out of danger, and this kept thousands in the town, whose carcasses went into the great pits by cartloads, and who, if they had fled from the danger, had, I believe, been safe from the disaster. At least 'tis probable they had been safe. And were this very fundamental only duly considered by the people on any future occasion of this or the like nature, I am persuaded it would put them upon quite different measures for managing the people from those that they took in 1665, or than any that have been taken abroad that I have heard of. In a word, they would consider of separating the people into smaller bodies, and removing them in time farther from one another, and not let such a contagion as this, which is indeed chiefly dangerous to collected bodies of people, find a million of people in a body together, as was very near the case before, and would certainly be the case if it should ever appear again. The plague, like a great fire, if a few houses only are contiguous where it happens, can only burn a few houses. Or if it begins in a single, or as we call it, a lone house, can only burn that lone house where it begins. But if it begins in a close-built town or city and gets ahead, there its fury increases. It rages over the whole place, and consumes all it can reach. I could propose many schemes on the foot of which the government of this city, if ever they should be under the apprehensions of such another enemy, God forbid they should, might ease themselves of the greatest part of the dangerous people that belong to them, I mean such as the begging, starving, and labouring poor, and among them chiefly those who, in case of a siege, are called the useless mouths, who being then prudently and to their own advantage disposed of, and the wealthy inhabitants disposing of themselves and of their servants and children, the city and its adjacent parts would be so effectually evacuated that there would not be above a 10th part of its people left together for the disease to take hold upon. But suppose them to be a 5th part, and that 250,000 people were left, and if it did seize upon them, they would, by their living so much at large, be much better prepared to defend themselves against the infection, and be less liable to the effects of it than if the same number of people lived close together in one smaller city, such as Dublin or Amsterdam or the like. It is true hundreds, yea thousands of families fled away at this last plague, but then of them many fled too late, and not only died in their flight, but carried the distemper with them into the countries where they went, and infected those whom they went among for safety, which confounded the thing, and made that be a propagation of the distemper, which was the best means to prevent it. And this too is an evidence of it, and brings me back to what I only hinted at before, but must speak more fully to here, namely, that men went about apparently well, many days after they had the taint of the disease in their vitals, and after their spirits were so seized as that they could never escape it, and that all the while they did so they were dangerous to others. I say, this proves that so it was, for such people infected the very towns they went through, as well as the families they went among, and it was by that means that almost all the great towns in England had the distemper among them, more or less, and always they would tell you such a Londoner or such a Londoner brought it down. It must not be omitted that when I speak of those people who were really thus dangerous, I suppose them to be utterly ignorant of their own conditions, for if they really knew their circumstances to be such as indeed they were, they must have been a kind of wilful murderers if they would have gone abroad among healthy people, and it would have verified indeed the suggestion which I mentioned above, and which I thought seemed untrue, viz., that the infected people were utterly careless as to giving the infection to others, and rather forward to do it than not. And I believe it was partly from this very thing that they raised that suggestion, which I hope was not really true in fact. I confess no particular case is sufficient to prove a general, but I could name several people within the knowledge of some of their neighbours and families yet living who showed the contrary to an extreme. One man, a master of a family in my neighbourhood, having had the distemper, he thought he had it given him by a poor workman whom he employed, and whom he went to his house to see, and went for some work that he wanted to have finished, and he had some apprehensions even while he was at the poor workman's door, but did not discover it fully. But the next day it discovered itself, and he was taken very in, upon which he immediately caused himself to be carried into an outbuilding which he had in his yard, and where there was a chamber over a workhouse, the man being a brazier. Here he lay, and here he died, and would be tended by none of his neighbours, but by a nurse from abroad, and would not suffer his wife, nor children, nor servants to come up into the room, lest they should be infected, but sent them his blessings and prayers for them by the nurse, who spoke it to them at a distance, and all this for fear of giving them the distemper, and without which he knew, as they were kept up, they could not have it. And here I must observe also that the plague, as I suppose all distempers do, operated in a different manner on differing constitutions. Some were immediately overwhelmed with it, and it came to violent fevers, vomitings, insufferable headaches, pains in the back, and so up to ravings and ragings with those pains. Others with swellings and tumours in the neck or groin or armpits, which, till they could be broke, put them into insufferable agonies and torment, while others, as I have observed, were silently infected, the fever preying upon their spirits insensibly, and they seeing little of it till they fell into swooning and faintings and death without pain. I am not physician enough to enter into the particular reasons and manner of these differing effects of one and the same distemper, and of its differing operation in several bodies, nor is it my business here to record the observations which I really made, because the doctors themselves have done that part much more effectually than I can do, and because my opinion may in some things differ from theirs. I am only relating what I know, or have heard, or believe of the particular cases, and what fell within the compass of my view, and the different nature of the infection as it appeared in the particular cases which I have related. But this may be added too, that though the former sort of those cases, namely those openly visited, were the worst for themselves as to pain, I mean those that had such fevers, vomitings, headaches, pains, and swellings, because they died in such a dreadful manner, yet the latter had the worst state of the disease, for in the former they frequently recovered, especially if the swellings broke, but the latter was inevitable death. No cure, no help could be possible. Nothing could follow but death. And it was worse also to others, because, as above, it secretly and unperceived by others or by themselves communicated death to those they conversed with, the penetrating poison insinuating itself into their blood in a manner which is impossible to describe, or indeed conceive. This infecting and being infected without so much as its being known to either person is evident from two sorts of cases which frequently happened at that time, and there is hardly anybody living who was in London during the infection, but must have known several of the cases of both sorts. 1. Fathers and mothers have gone about as if they had been well, and have believed themselves to be so, till they have insensibly infected and been the destruction of their whole families, which they would have been far from doing if they had the least apprehensions of their being unsound and dangerous themselves. A family whose story I have heard was thus infected by the father, and the distemper began to appear upon some of them even before he found it upon himself. But searching more narrowly, it appeared he had been affected some time, and as soon as he found that his family had been poisoned by himself, he went distracted, and would have laid violent hands upon himself, but was kept from that by those who looked to him, and in a few days died. 2. The other particular is, that many people, having been well to the best of their own judgment, or by the best observation which they could make of themselves for several days, and only finding a decay of appetite, or a light sickness upon their stomachs, nay, some whose appetite was quite strong, and even craving, and only a light pain in their heads, have sent for physicians to know what ailed them, and have been found, to their great surprise, at the brink of death, the tokens upon them, or the plague grown up to an incurable height. It was very sad to reflect how such a person as this last mentioned above had been a walking destroyer perhaps for a week or a fortnight before that, how he had ruined those that he would have hazarded his life to save, and had been breathing death upon them, even perhaps in his tender kissing and embracings of his own children. Yet thus certainly it was, and often has been, and I could give many particular cases where it has been so. If then the blow is thus insensibly striking, if the arrow flies thus unseen and cannot be discovered, to what purpose are all the schemes for shutting up or removing the sick people? Those schemes cannot take place but upon those that appear to be sick, or to be infected, whereas there are among them at the same time thousands of people who seem to be well, but are all that while carrying death with them into all companies which they come into. This frequently puzzled our physicians, and especially the apothecaries and surgeons, who knew not how to discover the sick from the sound. They all allowed that it was really so, that many people had the plague in their very blood, and preying upon their spirits, and were, in themselves, but walking putrefied carcasses, whose breath was infectious and their sweat poison, and yet were as well to look on as other people, and even knew it not themselves. I say, they all allowed that it was really true in fact, but they knew not how to propose a discovery. My friend Dr. Heath was of the opinion that it might be known by the smell of their breath, but then he said, who durst smell to that breath for his information, since to know it he must draw the stench of the plague up into his own brain, in order to distinguish the smell. I have heard it was the opinion of others that it might be distinguished by the parties breathing upon a piece of glass, where, the breath condensing, there might living creatures be seen by a microscope, of strange, monstrous, and frightful shapes, such as dragons, snakes, serpents, and devils horrible to behold. But this I very much question the truth of, and we had no microscopes at that time, as I remember, to make the experiment with. It was the opinion also of another learned man that the breath of such a person would poison and instantly kill a bird, not only a small bird, but even a cock or hen, and that if it did not immediately kill the latter, it would cause them to be roupy, as they called it, particularly that if they had laid any eggs at any time, they would be all rotten. But those are opinions which I never found supported by any experiments, or heard of others that had seen it, so I leave them as I find them, only with this remark, namely, that I think the probabilities are very strong for them. Some have proposed that such persons should breathe hard upon warm water, and that they would leave an unusual scum upon it, or upon several other things, especially such as are of a glutinous substance and are apt to receive a scum, and support it. But from the whole I found that the nature of this contagion was such that it was impossible to discover it at all, or to prevent its being spread from one to another by any human skill. Here was indeed one difficulty which I could never thoroughly get over to this time, and which there is but one way of answering it that I know of, and it is this, viz., the first person that died of the plague was on December 20th, or thereabouts, 1664, and in or about Long Acre. Whence the first person had the infection was generally said to be from a parcel of silks imported from Holland, and first opened in that house. But after this we heard no more of any person dying of the plague, or of the distemper being in that place, till the 9th of February, which was about 7 weeks after, and then one more was buried out of the same house. Then it was hushed, and we were perfectly easy as to the public for a great while, for there were no more entered in the weekly bill to be dead of the plague till the 22nd of April, when there were 2 more buried, not out of the same house, but out of the same street, and as near as I can remember it was out of the next house to the first. This was 9 weeks asunder, and after this we had no more till a fortnight, and then it broke out in several streets, and spread every way. Now the question seems to lie thus: where lay the seeds of the infection all this while? How came it to stop so long, and not stop any longer? Either the distemper did not come immediately by contagion from body to body, or, if it did, then a body may be capable to continue infected without the disease discovering itself many days, nay, weeks together. even not a quarantine of days only, but soixantine, not only 40 days, but 60 days, or longer.
End of section 20.
Dennis Sayers in Modesto, California, for LibriVox. Spring 2007.